Broadcasting Company presents Tales of the Foreign Service, a feature at NBC's University of the Air, written and produced in cooperation with the State Department and dedicated to the personnel of the Foreign Service. The material used in this series is based upon the confidential files of the State Department, much of it never before released to the public.
One of America's foremost secretaries of state was the practical idealist Elihu Root. His brilliance as a lawyer, his magnificence as a statesman, are equaled only by the vision he had of a world in which nations might work together like men in solving human problems in the light of reason and justice for all. Root once said of President Theodore Roosevelt, under whom he served as Secretary of State, something which his biographers say might well be applied to Elihu Root himself.
He did not think of the international situations which demanded action as being mere occasions of the moment, but he treated each situation as an incident to a national course of conduct. And he always acted under a strong sense of obligation to make the conduct of America tend toward her own peace and the peace of the world.
Born of a New England mathematics professor who was nicknamed Q, Elihu Root grew to earn his own nickname of Square. As a lawyer, he built his practice into a $200,000 a year business. And it is typical of the man that he would give up wealth and private practice to lend his multivaried talents to affairs of state. There is one anecdote told about Elihu Root when he was a lawyer, which has significance for our own time and illustrates his foresight. At a dinner at the Lotus Club, famous New York gathering place for literary and professional men from that day to this, on January 24th, 1885, Mr. Root made an amazing observation which created a mild furor.
And what would you like for dessert, Mr. Root? What are you having, Charles? Huh?
The French pastry looks good.
Yes, give me one of those eclairs.
Very well, sir.
There you are. Thank you.
You haven't answered my question, Elihu.
Oh, my dear Charles, why should I tell you the subject of my after-dinner speech? Isn't it tedious enough having to listen once?
I was just thinking, I don't envy you having to speak at all. The dynamiting of Westminster Hall this morning has lent a faint air of unreality to the day. An anarchist can walk into public buildings with a stick of dynamite and damage a landmark like the British House of Commons. Things have reached a sorry state indeed.
It could happen here, my dear Charles.
No, it isn't very likely. There are laws in America.
Antiquated laws. Laws made in 1778, before dynamite was discovered.
What?
Certainly. A fellow could walk into the Lotus Club or even the White House in Washington, dynamite it to blue blazes and get off scot-free. Our laws don't specify that a man can't use dynamite. So as a lawyer, I can tell you, if I were defending such an anarchist, I could, under the laws of this country, get him acquitted of any blame under that technicality.
Great Jehoshaphat. Then we'd better change our laws.
Bring them up to date. And that's my after-dinner speech, Charles. But it's worth repeating, don't you think?
Root's blasting of the free dynamite laws might well be paralleled today in a new examination of our pre-atomic bomb legislation. It was such observation of necessary reforms that won him the attention of the White House. His background in law and his interest in world affairs made him an ideal candidate for a high cabinet position. Elihu Root became Secretary of War under President McKinley at the end of the Spanish-American War. One of the burning problems confronting him in his new job was the question of how to deal with the situation in the Philippines. Those islands, previously owned by Spain, had simultaneously with our own war rebelled against Spanish domination, and our occupation troops were faced with an insurrection. Besides this, there was unrest in Cuba and Puerto Rico. These three countries had to have new forms of civil government worked out. At the same time, they were being occupied by the military forces. Nelson A. Miles, the general commanding the Army, had been helpless to deal with these first post-war tasks, since he had been almost completely ignored by the administration. On the morning of his first day in office, Secretary Root held an important meeting.
Now, gentlemen, if you'll all be seated, I'll make this very brief. General Miles, will you sit by me, please?
Certainly, Mr. Secretary.
I'll come directly to the point. I have called you representatives of the various bureaus of the War Department to this conference because I suspect it's a rare occasion when all of you get together. For example, let us take the case of General Miles.
Me, sir?
You, sir. I have seen orders signed by you that I dare say you have not seen.
Oh, yes, many. To speak quite frankly, I'm little more than a rubber stamp, I fear.
I don't like that. And I rather imagine you don't like it either.
It's customary to use my office as general commanding the army in this way, Mr. Secretary.
Customary? This country, our government, is or should be a constantly changing, a constantly growing organism. So must our own War Department. And we must begin by unifying ourselves.
Mr. Secretary, if you'll pardon my speaking out like this,
By all means.
we aren't unified, as you say, simply because no one has ever suggested we work as one department. By the very organization of the War Department, our separate bureaus have had certain autonomy.
But how ridiculous and how impractical.
Mr. Secretary, I'd like to present the other side.
Just a moment. It's common talk that this department is broken up into hostile camps.
Oh, no, I wouldn't say that. That's pretty strong, sir.
Human nature. You know how people are.
Fiddlesticks. Now, we're going to ignore the merits or lack of them of the past way of doing things. And we're going to forget past controversies. We're starting from scratch beginning today. We're going to work together, or not at all. And if anyone's personal opinions are at variance with a unified War Department, I'll see that he's released for duty in more compatible surroundings. Because, gentlemen, I'm taking the war out of the War Department.
Root's policy of changing to fit the needs of a changing age was a continuing one. His work of reorganizing the War Department to make it function more smoothly and efficiently included many reforms. He abolished the title General Commanding the Army and many independent, uncorrelated bureaus, and substituted the new and lasting idea of a Chief of Staff who would represent and advise the Secretary of War and who would also synchronize all activities relating to the department. Furthermore, he arranged for constant interchange of ideas and activities between field and staff bureaus. This was revolutionary for the times in 1903, but his general organization has lasted to the present. The very next day, after the new secretary had this understanding with his newly organized War Department, he called another meeting to utilize it. And again, General Miles was present.
General Miles, I want you to prepare a report for me on the situation in the Philippines.
A report? On our troops or in regard to the insurrection, Mr. Secretary?
I want complete details on what is required in the way of materials, personnel, transportation, and so forth to put down this guerrilla warfare that is impeding the occupation. I want this bandit Aguinaldo put in his place.
Well, we have scarcely enough troops there now for the task, Mr. Root.
Yes, that's what I feared. Now, what offhand in the way of men would we need?
I'd say about 70,000 men in all would handle it.
And you need about 10 regiments more?
Yes.
Very well, we'll recruit them with orders to pacify the island. And when this uprising is squashed, I'll have a plan ready for the form of civil government for the Philippines to be administered by our military forces without bayonets. Something new for the natives. And one that should make a few friends for us. Friends we may need someday.
Root's plan of a new kind of civil government was meticulous and realistic. He drafted a constitution, composed statutes covering taxes, an education system, laws to ensure justice for all, and trade agreements. This plan was submitted as a temporary measure, but it was so perfectly conceived that McKinley signed it as instructions of the President to the Philippine Commission, and Congress ratified it as a permanent basis of government for the islands until their independence, which was to come on July 4th, 1946. Another international crisis confronted Root in 1900, when he was to learn in a very real way what it might mean to be an American citizen caught overseas in unfriendly territory. This was in the case of the Boxer Rebellion. Besieged in Peking, China, our minister, Mr. Conger, and his wife and staff found themselves barricaded in the British compound and under bombardment from the Chinese, who had unexpectedly risen in wrath against the White Devil.
Well, they've ambushed us, Jack. I suppose they'll continue to bombard us until we either give up or...
Well, how long can we hold out, Mr. Congress?
I don't know, son. Just wish our families could be moved out of Peking. I could face almost anything myself, but those crowds in the street are murderous barbarians. They'll stop at nothing.
You've heard the latest, I suppose?
No, Jack, what now?
They've murdered the German ambassador.
What?
Yes, shot him down this morning. And the Japanese ambassador has been assassinated.
One by one, eh? Thank goodness the British offered us shelter in this compound. We aren't liked very much, are we foreigners?
What I can't understand is why the British or our own government does nothing.
Oh, America's so far away. So is England. We're just a headline in a newspaper to the folks back there.
The situation in the United States was difficult. John Hay, the Secretary of State, was very ill and could do nothing. But Root was quick to act when he was informed of the dilemma of Americans in China.
Mr. President, I should like permission to take supervisory control over the State Department in Mr. Hay's temporary absence. You know the details, of course, on the rebellion in Peking?
Yes, Mr. Root. What do you advise?
I propose we send our troops there as quickly as possible.
I agree. But troops from the United States will take months to get to China. Meanwhile, our citizens, our ministers, they may all be massacred.
General Chaffee is in the Philippines with some 70,000 troops which are no longer needed there.
Of course. Brilliant. Fully idea.
Let us get in touch with Chaffee and let him rescue not only our own citizens, but such other ambassadors and citizens of other friendly countries as may be endangered.
Do it. Do it by all means. At once, Mr. Root. At once.
Root's quick thinking and decisive action saved lives in China and won friends for the United States. But in 1902 came a domestic crisis.
I tell you, Elihu, I must intervene in this anthracite coal strike. Here it is October. Winter's coming on. There'll be no coal. The deadlock between the miners and the owners seems to have no solution.
I don't think the miners will like it, Mr. President, or the owners either, if you have to step in.
Well, but if they can't or won't settle it among themselves, what alternative have I? You know under what pressure I'm placed, and the people look to their president in such emergencies.
Have you talked to Mr. Morgan?
No.
You know, he's quite an influence in coal-carrying railroads. What about laying some proposals before him and getting his help? Now, he might have some very valuable ideas. And that way, we'll avoid government intervention by the politicians, as they call it.
But how can Mr. Morgan do anything?
He might suggest to the miners and the coal interests that they come to you. That way, they'd have to ask you to settle the strike, and it wouldn't then be your idea to intervene. How about it?
You're no lawyer, Elihu. You're a diplomat, by gad. Let's do it. Your way.
In 1903, a year later, Root was to have another opportunity to prove his brilliant diplomacy. In London, while serving on the Alaska Boundary Commission.
My word, almost midnight. That was a long signal. Would you like to stop and have a cup of tea before I drop you at your quarters, Mr. Root?
No, thank you. Would you mind driving through Green Park for a while? My head is reeling from all that talk.
By all means. Coachman, Green Park. Just drive round till I tell you to take us home.
Right, sir.
Fall is lovely in England.
You know, Mr. Root, I've been thinking about what you said today. About that treaty that was made in 1825 between Great Britain and Russia.
Oh, yes?
And I was thinking about something you left unsaid.
Money is at the root of all evil.
Ah. At last, a diplomat who also knows his Bible.
Well, if gold hadn't been found in Alaska, there'd never have been a dispute over the boundary lines between your United States and Canada. Why should greed change a man's word?
Yes, if we cannot abide by man's verbal agreements, how can there ever be trust between countries?
I'm an idealist as you are, Mr. Root. But do you honestly think the golden rule is practical in diplomacy and in a nation's foreign policy?
Nothing is as practical as honor and honesty and fair play. The golden rule was laid down for men, and nations are composed of men. It's really as simple as that. Only it may take a few more years for man to stumble upon a truth that's been waiting for him for 2,000 years.
Everywhere Root went, he won men over, men of all nations in the world. On July 1st, 1905, when the Secretary of State, John Hay, died, Root was asked by President Roosevelt to succeed Hay. As in the case of his first day in the War Department, Root immediately called a meeting of his State Department staff.
I think we need no introduction to each other, gentlemen. We have worked together before on numerous occasions. I know something about the problems of this department, and I pledge myself to solve them with your help.
You can depend on us, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, gentlemen, thank you. First of all, let's get our house in order. We need a new system of files, indexing, and of handling the archives. Jim, that's your job.
Yes, sir.
We're badly understaffed. Maybe I can steal a few men from the War Department. If necessary, I'll ask Congress to give us help. And there's another thing. I want to reorganize the consular service. That's certainly a matter for Congress, and one with a high priority.
Taking office in the midst of the peace negotiations between Russia and Japan, which had been brought about by President Roosevelt, Root's first administrative move resulted in sweeping reforms in the State Department. He went to Congress and explained the necessity and desirability of reorganizing the consular service. He advocated creating classes or grades under rules which would enable him to shift consuls and diplomatic agents from post to post, assigning stations according to aptitude and experience, and appointing higher officers by promotions from below according to merit. So far as he could, he put this plan into practice while waiting for Congress to act. And when the new law, approved in April 1906, became effective, all consular fees were abolished, and a system of graded salaries established instead. The story is told of his interviews with new consuls, how they quaked with terror at being summarily called for inspection by the secretary.
Yes? Come in. Well?
You wanted to see me, sir?
Did I indeed? Why?
I'm your new consul to Rio, sir.
So?
Is there something wrong, Mr. Secretary?
That's what I'm trying to find out. You're trembling, lad. Don't tell me you're afraid of me.
No, sir, but it's so unusual to have an interview with the Secretary of State.
A new wrinkle, eh?
Yes. Normally, a consul never meets the Secretary.
But you're my representative, aren't you?
Yes, sir.
Then let's put it on this basis. I like to know what sort of man represents me. That's fair enough, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
Are you always so polite?
Sir?
Please sit down and stop being so nervous. I like your manners. I like your neatness, and I like your record.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
But I don't like all those yeses. A diplomat should be courteous, but he should be able to say no with yes when necessary. You understand? Have a cigar.
Thank you, but not unless you join me.
That's what I mean, young man. That's exactly what I mean.
In the summer of 1906, Secretary of State Elihu Root made the grand tour of Central and South American republics as the United States delegate to the Third International Conference of American Republics at Rio de Janeiro. It was at this important meeting that he made his now famous remark, which established a good neighbor policy between North and South America.
We wish for no victories, but those of peace. For no territory except our own. For no sovereignty except sovereignty over ourselves. We deem the independence and equal rights of the smallest and weakest member of the family of nations entitled to as much respect as those of the greatest empire. And we deem the observance of that respect the chief guarantee of the weak against the oppression of the strong. We neither claim nor desire any rights or privileges or power that we do not freely concede to every American republic.
In addition to visiting Rio, Root directed the cruiser Charleston on to Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, Peru, Panama, and Colombia. And as he made friends with the people of South America, he explained the scope and meaning of the Monroe Doctrine. He talked informally with all men of all stations, holding such conversations and discussions as,
You see, Senor, we in the United States want to understand the desires and wishes of the people of South American countries.
What you have been saying, Senor Root, is most gratifying, and, if you will forgive me, surprising. We have been given to understand that the United States presume to assume a sort of, shall I say it, unwarranted suzerainty over our republic for your own purposes.
The important thing between us in the North and you in the South is that we get to know each other, Senor. Why should we be suspicious of one another? We are neighbors, and therefore we should be friends.
During his visit to South America, Elihu Root also promised to try to get the Hague Tribunal to adopt the principle that
in the International High Court of Arbitral Justice, each sovereignty should have an equal representation, regardless of size, wealth, and position.
In January 1909, he left the Department of State to become a member of the Foreign Relations Committee as United States Senator. He watched the First World War with its enormous international repercussions and implications, and he was to write, in the midst of it, these moving lines to Charles Francis Adams, whose father had been a master statesman.
It is incredible that after this war, the world should go on to do precisely the same things in precisely the same way. To put a better scheme of things into operation, however, will involve solving difficult practical problems. My moral nature is being ruined by habitual anger at a lot of fools who think that difficulties can be solved by refusing to see them. In order that there shall be an adequate law, there must be agreement upon adequate rules of conduct. In order that the judgment of the court applying this law shall be respected, there must be sanctions for its enforcement. And here we come to the international police force. It is going to be a business for experts who combine technical knowledge with imagination.
The League of Nations, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, the Disarmament Conference seemed to root steps, but not quite the right or final ones, toward a realistic view of international relations. In all his long and active life, Root did more than any other individual up to his time to unify and pacify the international tendencies of mankind. He signed arbitration treaties with practically all of the civilized governments of the world. And his efforts to have the Hague Tribunal constituted upon a basis of equal national sovereignty instead of according to size, wealth, or population are of inestimable value. Elihu Root dreamed a dream as did few men before him. A dream which was to culminate in the United Nations, the concept of a World Security Council and of an international bar of justice. Forecast, strangely enough, by the poet Tennyson. For I dipped into the future, far as human eye could see, saw a vision of the world and all the wonder there could be, when the war drum throbs no longer and the battle flags are furled in the Parliament of Man, Federation of the World.
You've been listening to the last episode of Tales of the Foreign Service, which has been a feature of the NBC University of the Air, written and produced in cooperation with the State Department.